Good morning, everybody. Let's stand to our feet. We're going to enter into a time of worship together, so let's do that. In Psalms 34, it talks about tasting and seeing of the goodness of God and taking refuge in what God has to offer us. So let's sing these words together, and let's do that.
Moving forward to follow after you.
goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful, and all my life you have been so good. Every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. Let me hear you. He's led you through the fire. And it led me through the fire, darkest night. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father, known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful, and all my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. We're running for you, Jesus. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Running after Jesus. And all my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. Every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful, no matter what I go through. And all my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God. We sing of your goodness, Jesus. God, thank you for this time that we have just to worship you, to find you in your goodness, God. Thank you for meeting us here, God. Thank you for being with us in this room, God, and for just always being with us through everything that we go through, God. We go through hard things, God. We go through easy things, but you're there through it all, and we're so thankful, God. Thank you for waking us up this morning, God, and for bringing us to this place, where we can just be with these people, God, and be with you, God. We love you so much, and we're so thankful for this. And in your precious name we say, amen. You can have a seat.
Hi everyone, my name is Georgina and I'm here at our food pantry. This is where we get ready for our food distribution that happens every month, the fourth Sunday of every month, which is today from 1 to 3. Anybody is welcome to come. We actually just had a food drive here and our FCC families donated food and we are able to serve between 65 to 100 families thanks to your generosity. If you'd like to learn more about this, you could go to fcchb.com/recap. This is possible because of your food donation and also your financial giving. So thank you again. And if you'd like to give financially, you could go to fcchb.com/give. Right now, we're about to jump into the 5th week of the series, Deconstructing Church.
Several years ago, I heard this statement, and I don't remember where I heard it from or who I heard it from. I wish I did because I could give him credit. I tried to remember. But I heard this statement, and it has stuck with me. And I want to share it with you. And it goes like this. I put it on the screen so we could see it. That in life, you can make a point or you can make a difference, but not both. And again, I know there's exceptions to every rule, and so you could look at this and say, oh, well, I know someone who's made a point and a difference. I get all that. But by and large, throughout my life, I have seen that this statement is true. You can either make a point or a difference. Now, to make a point actually comes from the action of pointing. It's to highlight something. It's to make something's presence known. Look at this, look at that. That's making a point. But a difference is about change. A difference is about transformation. So really, in our lives, we can either dedicate our lives to making a point. Look, hear this, see this, there it is. Or we can dedicate our lives toward changing things, toward actually making a difference. But we have to choose which one is it going to be, because you really can't do both. And there are prominent examples all around us of people and groups of people who are either trying to make a point or make a difference. When you talk about making a point, the first place I think you see currently people trying to make a point is in American politics. American politics really, from my perspective, you look at it and you have two sides. And each side is arguing like passionately really for the same point. And their point is that the other side is destroying the country. These people are destroying the country, these people are destroying the country. And they're making that point loud and clear. And they're making it all over TV, newspapers, social media, everywhere. And that's their point. They're going to live and die on that point. The other side is destroying the country. Here's the irony of it, the whole thing though, is in making that point, and they may be right. One of these sides may be true. That may 100% be true that the other side is destroying the country. But in betting everything on let's make this point, they're furthering the division and further destroying the country. Now, on the other hand, when you talk about making a difference, somebody who spent their life making a difference is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now here's the interesting thing about making a difference is making a difference is often like really messy. It's really difficult. You know, now I know you could sit here and you could say, well, Dr. King had a point, and he did have a point. His point was about injustice and racial inequality and what equality should be like. Yes, that was a point that he was making. But if you look at his life and his actions and ultimately what led to his assassination and his death, it wasn't just because he was trying to make a point, it's because he was trying to make a difference. It wasn't enough for him to highlight that there was racial injustice or inequality. He wanted to actually change things. And the fact that he was willing to change things is what opened him up to criticism. Because when you're trying to make a point is usually pretty clean and easy. Because trying to make a point, you draw a clear line, and there's those of us on this side and those on that side. And we're right and you're wrong. And our point is correct and your point is wrong. But when you try to make a difference, is about actually engaging in the mess of life. And it's about getting into the mess of people's lives and into the mess of the world and into the mess of cultural and societal issues. And that opens you up to criticism. That's why throughout his life and even after his life, people have criticized Dr. King and said, well, he should have done this, or why did he do this? He shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have talked to this person. He shouldn't have talked to that person. But the reason he did all those things is because it wasn't just enough to make a point. He also wanted to make a difference. And see, people that want to make a difference oftentimes get in trouble, which is ultimately what led to not just Dr. King being thrown in jail, but to his assassination. And so in life, you and I have to decide, like, what is it we really want to do? Do we want to make a difference, or do we want to make a point? And most of the time, we opt for making a point because it's easier, it's cleaner, and quite honestly, it results in social media followers and fame and power and success. People will flock to you if you make a point, but the reality is nothing will change. Now, the 1960s was an interesting time in U.S. history. This is just a random picture that I took of, I just literally Googled 1960s protest, and this is what came up. And you can see in this, there's people protesting all kinds of things. You have, protesting for equal rights. You have Vietnam protesting, all kinds of things. But the 1960s, I wasn't alive through the 1960s. A lot of us weren't, but a lot of us were. But if you know anything about that period of time, it's this time of massive social upheaval within the U.S. When you get to like post-World War II in the USA, like the 50s, the 50s is kind of like, oftentimes it's like the Leave It to Beaver period of time. You know, it's this time where it's like post-war and everyone settles down and America becomes a very moral place. There's kind of like religious renewal and America's seen as a very Christian place and there's good families and everything's strong and everything's good. And that's what leads into the 60s. So then you get in the 60s and you have all of these kind of movements and you have all of these kind of protests. And again, some of them are around civil rights, some of them around issues of gender or sex, some of them around government and war and all these different kinds of things. And so the 1960s represents this like massive upheaval of what in the 50s had essentially been, hey, here's a solid Christian society. What might be called like a Christendom society. Christendom is a term that's used to label any society where Christianity is normal, right? Like this is Christianity's normal. It's what it's expected. It's kind of what the moral society is founded on. So in the 50s, the U.S. is a very like Christendom society. But when you get into the 60s, there's all this upheaval and that all changes. And what you have after the 60s is you have a lot of Christians who begin to really, instead of trying to make a difference, they begin to try to make a point. And let's highlight all of the things that have changed as a result of all these social upheavals and how they're destroying our country, our nation, our culture. Now, granted, there's a lot of things about the 60s that were really good. A lot of those movements, civil rights being one of them, that was really, really good. But others of them, it's kind of debated. And so what happens within American Christianity is post the 60s, you get a lot of Christians and a lot of churches that begin to focus on, no, we need to make a point on what we've lost. Look at all the things we've lost because this thing led to this thing led to this thing led to that, and here's what we've lost. And so it seems to be when you look at the history of Christianity in America, in that post kind of the 60s upheaval, the church in this country really, probably before that honestly, but really began to transition from making a difference to making a point. And here's what's really fascinating. When you look at church engagement, here's a graph that shows church engagement over time. And if you were to extend it back this way, it holds pretty level, like 73, 76, 73. Even if you go further back, it holds way further back. So the number of people who were engaged in church in the U.S., it's like, it holds right there. 3/4 of the country until you hit the 60s. And post the 60s. And then it just starts to decline and decline and decline. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that at this pivotal moment in history, in American history at least, when there's all this upheaval, churches and Christians in our country opted for making a point over making a difference. And in making a point, they ended up alienating large portions of the population around us. And the church's influence and significance and even percentage of attendance began to rapidly decline and is doing even more so recently. See, we've made and I don't even think the church made it consciously. I think it was like the subconscious choice we made. And when I say church, I'm talking about like all Christians all across our nation. We opted to, hey, let's make our mission about making a point of what is wrong with our culture and why our culture is going to hell. The problem with that is the mission of the church was never about making a point. Never about making a point. The story of the Bible, if you look at the story of the Bible, it begins in Genesis, ends in Revelation. The story of the Bible is ultimately about one thing. It's about renewal. It's about recreation. It's about new life. When you get to the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, it's this vision John has. John, one of Jesus' closest apostles. This vision that John has of where everything is headed. And here's what he says. He says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. This is where it's all heading. It's all heading toward renewal. It's all heading toward restoration. It's all heading to restoring creation to what God originally had in mind when he created it back in Genesis. It's about new life. It's about birth. And this story of a new heaven and a new earth, it begins with Israel. This is why God calls Israel in the Old Testament. You will be for me this kingdom that will show the world what new creation is supposed to be like. The mission of Israel reaches its climax in the person of Jesus, who comes out of Israel. He's a descendant of the great King David. And it's through Jesus' death and resurrection, his embodiment of the mission of Israel, that God begins this new creation. And throughout Jesus' life, you see moments, you see glimpses of what new creation life looks like. This is what Jesus' miracles are all about. When Jesus performs a miracle, like he performs a miracle, or he performs an exorcism, like he'll drive demons out, or even like Lazarus, he brings Lazarus back from the dead. These little miracles, these little moments, these are all glimpses of this is what the new world looks like. This is what a new creation looks like when God is in charge. We know what the world looks like when God is not in charge. That's a world that we live in. It's a world of chaos. It's a world of death. But when God is in charge, this is what the world looks like. And Jesus gives us glimpses of this. He gives us pictures of this. And he invites us to begin to live this way. We can start to live as this new creation because beginning with Jesus, this new creation is now like breaking into the old creation. And we start to see it here and there. And that's really what the church is about. The church is about embodying what it means to live in a new creation. And that's why the mission of the church is to live differently. The mission of the church is to bring the future kingdom of God, the future reign of God into the present through the way that we live. The mission of the church is about making a difference in this world and showing what the world is going to be like when God is actually in charge and he finishes the work that he began in Israel and that reached its climax in Jesus, and that he is still bringing about through his Spirit and through his church. But again, doing this is about making a difference. It's not about making a point. When you make a point, you create lines of demarcation. You create these lines of this is who's in, this is who's out. This is us, this is them. But when you make a difference, it just gets really messy. See, when you make a point, you determine your fellowship by whether or not we agree. Do I agree with you? If I agree with you, then I'll go to church with you, I'll hang out with you, we'll be friends. But if I disagree with you, you're out because I have a point to make here. And if I'm friends with you, if I talk with you, if I engage with you, then you risk me not making my point. And I have to make this point as clear as I can. Now, what's interesting about that is when Jesus talked about truth, because that's what we say when we want to make a point, right? This is what's true. I got to stand for the truth. When Jesus talked about truth, here's what Jesus had to say about truth. In Matthew 7:16-17, he said, "By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles?" By the way, that's intended to be like a joke. It's like a no-duh statement. "Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit." And Jesus' whole point is he goes, look, you know what someone believes by the way they act. You don't know what someone believes just because they tell you they believe something. It's because they sign off on a belief statement. Jesus cared what people believed. It's not like Jesus didn't care what people believed. Jesus cared very much what people believed. He also just understood that the only way to really know what someone believes is look at what their life produces. That's what fruit is, right? It's what a tree produces. Our life is what we produce. Jesus said, if you want to know what someone really believes, look at what they produce. Because you can stand up there and say things all day and you can make points till you're blue in the face. But if you're not producing an actual impact or change or transformation in you, in the people around you, in your community, then do you really believe what it is that you're saying you believe? See, for Jesus, faith was a way of life. It wasn't a list of doctrines. It wasn't a thing of points that we all agreed on. It was a way of life. It was how we lived in connection and relationship with the larger world around us and the impact that we had on that world. Now, before we began, Georgina, who was on the video, she said that we were in I think it's the 5th week of our series, Deconstructing Church. And if you've been through any part of this series, we're wrapping it up today. Next week, we're going to start a new series. But we're wrapping up this series, Deconstructing Church. And what we've been doing throughout this whole series is really trying to just have an honest discussion about what we take for granted when it comes to church. When we hear the word church, there's all kinds of things that we assume. Some of us assume good things, some of us assume bad things, but there's things that we take for granted about this is what the church should do and this is what the church should be. And what we've tried to do in this series is to try to explore those and say, what does it really mean to be the church? What is it the church is supposed to actually do? Because a lot of the things we take for granted about church really come from the culture and the world around us and really are not what Jesus had in mind when he talked about the church. And one of the things we've done a lot throughout this series is we've looked at the earliest church, the church that existed in the first few centuries in the Roman Empire. And we've done that not to try to copy exactly what the early church did, because we can't and we shouldn't. The early churches existed in a very different world and a very different reality. But what we are trying to do is learn from the earliest churches, because those earliest churches lived in a pluralistic society that was very harsh to them. I mean, for the first few centuries of its existence, the church was an illegal entity within the Roman Empire. And in fact, the Roman Empire was actively trying to get rid of the church through various forms of persecution. But those earliest churches lived in such a way that not only were they able to make a difference in the harsh Roman world in which they lived, but ultimately they overcame the empire, and the empire actually converted to Christianity, which caused a whole other set of problems. But the fact that it happened was pretty incredible. And so what we've been doing is we've been trying to learn, what is it about how the early church lived that allowed them to thrive in an environment that was not a Christendom environment, in an environment that was hostile to them? And how did they not only survive, but how did they thrive? And what we've seen is what defined the early church, what defined their life together, was not doctrinal statements that they believed. I believe this, I believe that. What defined their life together was the practices that they engaged in. There was things that they did that were a regular part of their life. Those practices reinforced certain habits that became their natural response. And it's how they lived. Acts 2 is we've read this many times. It's a famous chapter. Acts is the book that talks about the earliest church. And in Acts 2, Luke describes, hey, here's what the early church looks like. It says this is the church, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So again, when you look at the church, what Luke describes is here's all the things they did together. They met together. They were committed to the apostles' teaching. They prayed. They ate together. They worshiped. It's all these things that they were routines. They were habits. They were practices. And it was these practices that formed their way of life, a way of life that was rooted in Jesus. And so it was their practices that defined them. It was their practices that formed that way of life, these things that they were committed to on a daily basis that formed their way of life. Now, the other thing Luke shows us is that when they engaged in these practices, it wasn't just in one location. See, when we talk about church today, we tend to think of church as a location. It's a place that you go. I go to this church. I go to that church. That language would have been completely foreign to the earliest Christians, because for them, church isn't some place you go, it's who you are. And so it's not like you go to church and then you do your church thing and then you go home and do other things. No, wherever you go, the church goes. And so you embody what it means to be the church in all of these different areas. That's why it says they met in the temple courts. They met in each other's homes. They're out in the streets. They're out in the neighborhoods. The church, part of the reason the church was so successful in the Roman world is because the church was everywhere. It wasn't confined to specific addresses. The church existed out and among the entire, what Luke highlights here is what Leslie Newbegin calls the gathered and scattered natures of the church. Newbegin talks about how the church, we are the church when we come together, we are the church when we gather, but we don't cease to be the church just because we scatter and we get in our cars and we go home to our specific homes, or we go to our workplaces or our streets, neighborhoods, whatever. We are still the church. And so what we learn from the early church is it's not enough just to be the church when we're gathered. We have to embody that same truth and way of life when we're scattered. And so what we've done to kind of help do that is we've used this model that we didn't create it. It was created, it's part of this book, Church's Movement, that's a church planning manual. But it's this model that kind of at least helps us think through how do I live as a Christian? How do I engage the Christian way of life when I'm scattered? And so again, if you've been here, you've seen this, but I want to share it again. We've talked about these three spheres of church life. The parish, which is a local congregation. That is a local church like this that you're a part of. And then there's pathways. These are the places we frequently go. We maybe go there a few times a month, not places randomly, but it could be, we drop our kids off for school, we drop our kids off for a sporting event, it's a coffee shop that we go to, a restaurant we hang out in all the time, it could be our workplaces, maybe some other club that we go to, we belong to, but it's places we go frequently. And then there's the porch. This is a place that we live. And so what we've been talking about is when you look at the early church, what made the early churches so successful is that they embodied the Christian way of life in each of these spheres. And so how do we do that? How do we learn to embody the Christian way of life? And again, it's not just, hey, here's the things I believe. No, it's what are the practices that we engage in that embody the Christian way of life in all three of these spheres. And we know that practices are going to look different in each of these spheres because the people are different in each of these spheres. So when you talk about practices, you can engage in the same practice in all three spheres, but it's going to look different. Now, the first question we ask is, well, what are the practices? What is it I'm supposed to do? We're saying the early church was formed by its practices. So what are the practices? You could go through the New Testament and you could come up with a list of 400 or 500 different things you should do. We've narrowed it down to kind of 7 core practices at FCC that we really want to focus on. We've shared these a bunch, but I'm going to put them up here again. They're gospel, prayer, worship, generosity, scripture, reconciliation, and service. Again, you could do more, and I'm not saying this is the only thing, but we've kind of done it and said, hey, if we can focus on these things, if we can work on embodying these 7 things in all 3 of these spheres, this is how we faithfully live what Jesus called the Christian way of life. And so it starts, if you go back to that model, it starts in the parish. It starts when we gather together. Because when you look at the earliest churches and when you look at how they lived, when they gathered together corporately, either as one large group like this, or sometimes they gather in smaller groups throughout the week in people's homes or in different places, the whole purpose of gathering together was to form ourselves in the Christian way of life. That's why you did it. And the way we form ourselves is we engage in these practices that become habits in our life. Really and essentially, in a lot of ways, the church becomes, the gathered church, the parish church becomes like a lab where we read the words of Jesus. Okay, here's what Jesus said, love your enemies. Okay, how do we do that? You know where you're supposed to learn how to do that? Right here. This is how we're supposed to learn with each other. How do we love our enemies? What does that look like? How do we be people who are peacemakers? How do we be people who seek reconciliation? How do we become people of service? Because this is not naturally who our culture forms us to be. You and I were formed in a culture that has really, for the most part, formed us to be the complete opposite of this. So we have to be formed to live a completely different way. And this is where we learn to do that with each other. Because guess what? There are people here that disagree with you. There are people here that have drastically different opinions from you. There are people here who have polar opposite opinions from you. And guess what? They're every bit as Christian as you are. So how do we learn to love each other? How do we learn to seek peace? We do it here. This is our lab. This is where we are committed to one another and we form what become the habits in our life so that when we go out into the pathways and when we go out into the porch, not that we have everything perfected, not that everything makes sense, but we have at least developed this way of life that allows us to begin to love our neighbors, to love our coworkers, to love the people that we see when we get coffee every morning. Because within the context of the parish, we have worked that out. We have wrestled through that together. We have struggled through the words of Jesus and the apostles, and we have also done things practically. See, it's not just enough to say something. You have to figure out practical ways to do it. So as we gather as a church, whether we gather here on weekends or whether we gather in other groups throughout the week, the whole point of us gathering is to form ourselves to live the Christian way of life. And everything we do isn't just about talking about it. We have to do things that actually embody it. So for example, what you'll see and what you'll hear as we begin to move forward is when you talk about our weekends, when we gather on weekends, our weekends are centered around 2 of these practices: gospel and worship. gospel is rooted in, we're starting a series next week called Gospel, where we're going to say, what is the gospel? But gospel is the good news of Jesus. And it's, a lot of times we simplify the gospel. It's bigger and better than most of us think. But the gospel is this good news that through Jesus, God is changing the world. That God is making the world right. And so every weekend, we're going to focus on that because you and I need to be reminded of that. The world in which we live is chaotic, but through Jesus, God is making it right. That's the power of the gospel. And worship is about our posture before God. It's about recognizing who God is. It's about surrendering to God. And so these are the things that our weekends are centered around. Doesn't mean it's the only things we're going to do, but it's what our weekends are going to be centered around. Now, it's not just enough to talk about these things. We actually have to do them. So how do we do them? Well, the way we worship on weekends is we sing. It's not the only way to worship. There's a ton of ways to worship. But it's the way that we do it corporately. The way we embody the gospel is we take communion. And we're going to do that in a little bit. Because communion is something we all do that is a specific practice that embodies the gospel and brings it literally into our lives. And so when we talk about the parish, everything we do as a parish, again, you're going to see this. We're going to be far more intentional about this as we move forward. Everything we do when we gather, whether it's big groups like this or Rooted or reading scripture in community or Women's Discovery Table or Fuel or whatever it is, the point of us gathering together is to form a Christian way of life. Doesn't mean that everyone who comes has to be Christian. We're all in different places. We all have different beliefs, we all have different understandings, but it's us coming together and trying to figure out what does it mean to live the Christian way of life. And as we pray together, as we study scripture together, as we proclaim and live the gospel out, as we live generously, we figure out how to do that till it becomes, the Christian way of life becomes our habit. We have been formed in its habits, not just accept its doctrines and beliefs, but we have been formed in its habits so that when we go out to the pathways, to the porch, we can begin to embody them. And understand, this is not an easy thing to do. It's not like, I don't know where you work, I don't know where you live. It may not be an easy thing to figure out, man, how do I embody the gospel where I work? How do I pray for people in my... This is going to be stuff that we're going to have to figure out together. This is why it's important for us to connect with one another. Prayer looks like, here as a gathered church, we can pray together. We can pray with one another. When you go to your work, you may not be able to pray with people, but you know what you can do? You can pray for people. You can begin to pray for specific people. And you know what one of the most powerful moments is? When prayer transitions from you praying for somebody to you praying with somebody. Maybe they come to you in a crisis and say, hey, can you pray with me? My life's fallen apart. My marriage is falling apart. My family's fallen apart. I lost my job, whatever. Can you pray with me? And someone that you have been praying for that now you're praying with, that is a powerful thing. And so there's no easy answers of, hey, this is how you do this. How do you be a person of reconciliation in your neighborhood? And that's going to look different for all of us. These aren't easy things to figure out. We always want easy answers. See, making a point makes an easy answer. But making a difference is we're going to have to work these things out. We're going to form them as habits as we gather together as a church, as a parish. And then we're going to go out and embody them and wrestle with what does that actually look like. But here's the big thing that is going to be, I think, it's the simplest concept, but I think it's the most difficult for us to do because everything about the world that we live is against this. The key, the thing that is central to actually building and fostering a Christian way of life in the world that you and I live in, the thing that is absolutely necessary that we have so often neglected in our culture is other people. See, we live in a culture that really post-Enlightenment, but even before that, is completely formed around the individual. It's all about you. And even this is one of the things Leslie Newbigin talks about is that we have privatized faith. We've taken faith. We don't talk about faith as public truth. We talk about faith as though it's this private thing. There's things that are public truth. These would be like, what we might call science or history or something like that, these factual things, and we'll talk about those. But the minute someone talks about faith, and this isn't just true of Christianity, this is true of any religious tradition, is faith is seen as, well, it's this other thing. It's this own private thing. And so we don't talk about Jesus the same way we would talk about other historical figures like, Abraham Lincoln or something. But it's like, well, the claim and the witness of the New Testament is that Jesus was just as historical as, somebody like Abraham Lincoln. So why? Well, that's faith. That's private. That's its own separate thing. And so we have been formed in this world that has made faith this incredibly private thing, and it's about me. And that's why we don't like to talk about certain things. That's why confession is hard for us. It's really difficult for us. That's why even things like when we start talking about money, it's like, well, hey, my money's mine. What I do with my money is between God and I. Let's not bring this out in the open. This isn't for all of us. But again, these are concepts that when you look at the earliest churches would be stunned by how individualistic we are. But that's the world that we've been formed into. And it's really interesting because even our worship is individualistic. When you look at the Psalms, which is a book in the Old Testament, it's ancient Israel's it's their collection of poems and songs that they would sing as a part of their worship to God. And there are some of the Psalms that are individual. It's individuals writing about a specific thing they're going through. But even most of the time, the individuals write about themselves. They're writing about themselves as a representative for all of Israel. So there might be like a me, but it's more like a plural me. Like, we are Israel. Why have you abandoned us, our people? Why have you left us? But the worship that we have done in the American church for a long time has been incredibly individualistic based. I was even reflecting this week on a lot of the songs that I grew up singing when I went to church. I've been in church my whole life. And when I grew up going to church, we sang what are called hymns. And there were great songs, and songs I knew and songs I sang. But as I reflected back at them, it never occurred to me how individualistic they were. I'm not saying they're bad. Don't hear me on that. I'm not saying they're bad. But watch, here's some of the most famous hymns that I sang. Okay, It Is Well With My Soul, which is a great song. Actually has a great story. The guy who wrote it, his family died horrifically in this, they sunk and they died at sea. They drowned at sea. Their boat sunk and they drowned. And as he was coming across the ocean in the same spot, he wrote this song, It Is Well With My Soul. But it's about me. It is well with my soul. All fly away is exactly what it sounds. All fly away, oh glory, all fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, all fly away. I told you I know the words. Amazing Grace is a classic. It is a great song. But Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine. These songs all go back into the 1800s. So this whole thing that we lament about, we live in this individualistic culture, it's not new. Now, I know some of you are thinking Scott, you're not fair. What about the new songs? The new songs are just as self-centered as the old songs. You are 100% right. A lot of new songs sound more like Jesus is my boyfriend than than anything else. But my point is that the whole individualism thing, it's not like it's new. It's not like it came out of nowhere. We have been singing, at least in the U.S., for over 100 years, songs that are focused on me. And really, you could push it all the way back to the 300s and 400s with a guy named Augustine, who's one of the most influential theologians in church history. Augustine did a lot of great work. One of the things Augustine did in his writing is, prior to Augustine, Christian faith was about external virtue. Are you developing the external virtues that allow you to live as a Christian? Augustine is the one who, through his writings, kind of transitioned that to make it about it's internal. It's about internal heart change and internal transformation. And he got away from some of the virtues like patience that had driven the early church. And he made it more internal. So my point is, the whole individualism thing, it's not like it's brand new. It's been around for centuries, and you and I have been formed in a faith that is completely individualistic. And now with the advent of social media and all these things, we become more and more isolated from each other. And so I really believe one of the reasons we have failed to form the kind of followers that the early church had is not because we don't love Jesus, not because we don't read the Bible, but because we don't actively engage our faith with other people in any sort of dynamic way. I was at the store a couple weeks ago, just Albertsons right up here at Seacliff Village, and I just needed a couple things. I just needed to pick up a couple things real quick. So I went in there and grabbed what I needed, and I went right toward the express checkout, where you can scan it yourself, because I was I just need to get in and get out real quick. So as I'm walking up to this line, there's this woman that comes walking up, and this woman, you can tell right away, she is completely clueless. She's got things in both hands, but she's just kind of looking around and just not paying attention to anyone else out there, not paying attention to what's going on, and just kind of wandering and looking at me. She looks like she's having fun, but she is just not in any way engaged with anyone or anything. And she's walking up, and I'm trying to get to the self-checkout line as fast as I can, and I walk there, and she cuts me right off. But she doesn't hurry. And she's one of these people that goes to the self-checkout line with 20 things. You know what I'm talking about? You're The self-checkout line is for like 5 things. If you have more than 5 things, don't go to the self-checkout. But she's standing there, and she starts scanning things like really slowly. And then she'll scan a couple things, and then like she'll just walk over and pick something else and look at it like, oh yeah, that's nice. And she'll go back. And she's not remotely in a hurry. And I can feel my like blood pressure and my heartbeat rising, and I'm getting angry. The check stand next to her frees up. So I walk over there next to her, and I'm scanning my things real quick. And I'm just trying to get in there, and I got to get a bag because I didn't have a bag. And as I walk over to a bag, this lady she just cuts me off. Like I don't even think she knew I was there. She was so out of it, never made eye, like she's just, again, wandering around aimlessly. And I saw her cut other people off. I saw her get in other people's way. I remember finally when I got my bag and paid for my stuff and walked out to my car, I was just frustrated. Now, I didn't do anything because it's like, I'm a pastor in town, and that's all you need is like, hey, the pastor of FCC, harasses one. So I didn't do anything. But I was frustrated. I was frustrated. And the whole reason I was frustrated is because I had something I needed to do, and I just needed to do it really quickly. And this woman was an obstacle to me doing what I needed to do. She was in my way. See, this is the thing about an individualistic culture. Here's what an individualistic culture does. It forms us, it shapes us to see other people as an obstacle. You are an obstacle to me getting what I want. You are in my way. And in an individualistic culture, the way that you succeed is you overcome obstacles, people, in order to get what you want. So you and I have lived our entire lives in a culture that is individualistic, which has shaped a church that is individualistic, which is why we don't put a whole lot of priority on deeply engaging our faith with other people. Our faith for us is something that we work out on our own. We work out it when we read the Bible in the morning. We work on it when we listen to podcasts or messages or other good Christian content or the books that we read. That's when we form our faith. We don't form it deeply with other people. That's the reason. I believe at the heart, not the only reason, but at the heart of the reason, the church has fallen apart in this country, particularly over the last 8 years. Because we did not form our faith deeply with other people. It became entirely individualistic. And to me, everything that happened in COVID, like, I know COVID gets kind of like this umbrella term, but as a part of COVID, there was issues of racism and gender and all these other different things. So I'm including all of that and all of this. Like, if you look at all that stuff, as all that stuff was going down, what did you see churches and Christian leaders do? They lived and died on making a point. Let's make a point. This is right or this is wrong. And we made so many points, and we flocked to people whose point we liked. We flocked to people who were trying to make the same point that we did. So we made all of these different points, and in the end, you know what happened? The church was in way worse shape than it was when it began. Because we focused so much on making a point, we alienated ourselves even further from one another, and we failed to make a difference. See, to me, that's what we learned through the last few years, or at least it's what we should have learned. I don't know if we did, but it's what we should have learned. Because we crumbled in crisis. In contrast to the earliest churches who, in the midst of a very harsh Roman Empire, a Roman Empire that persecuted them, a Roman Empire that killed them, they thrived and they flourished, ultimately to the point that they overcame the empire. And again, it wasn't because they loved Jesus more. It wasn't because they knew their Bible better. They didn't even have a New Testament for most of that period of time. That's when it was being put together. It wasn't because they were better people or stronger people. It wasn't because they had a better strategy or their churches were cooler or they had the best worship or the best. It wasn't any of that. It was the fact that their faith was formed together intimately as a community. The whole point of this deconstructing thing has been for us to kind of try to figure out what is it that the Spirit of God is doing in our church in this cultural moment. I've shared this before. Alan Roxborough calls this moment the Great Unraveling. And it's a metaphor that he uses, I've talked about this, but it's a child's blanket. You know, a lot of children have blankets or some have stuffed animals that is like their most important thing. They take it everywhere with them. I think it's Linus from the Peanuts is the one that drags a blanket with him. And a blanket's a very precious thing, but over time it begins to fray. It begins to unravel. And when it unravels, it's devastating to us because the blanket's important. It's this comfort thing. It's this thing that brings us a lot of safety. And Roxborough's point is, hey, this is what's happening with our culture. Our culture is something that brings us a lot of comfort. It's what brings us safety. It's what brings us security, but it is unraveling. And that's not a prediction. He's not saying, oh, we're all doomed to fail. No, he's just saying this is what's happening. The social fabric of our culture, our engagement with each other, our engagement with institutions, be they the church or government or whatever, that's unraveling. The social fabric of our culture is unraveling, and it's painful, and we're trying to figure out what to do. Our conviction as a church, as the staff, the leadership of this church, our conviction as a community is that behind all of this unraveling, God is weaving together a new creation through Jesus. And so what we've been talking about, it hasn't been the result of like, hey, we need a strategy session. Let's sit down and let's strategically think through. The result of all this has come about because we've been trying to figure out what is it that God is doing in and among us through this time. And how do we respond to what God is doing? Because God is the one that's ultimately guiding the church. God is the one that's ultimately leading to this new creation. The work of new creation, the work of renewal is rooted in what God is doing, not us. And so how do we become a part of that? And this is why we've been looking to the early church, because the early church wasn't perfect. God knows they made their share of mistakes. But they were able to not just survive, but thrive in a very harsh environment. And they did it by engaging in these practices in their parish, in their pathways, in their porches, by forming this Christian way of life together as local congregations and then embodying that in the places that they lived. But the foundation of all of that was mutuality. It was other people. It was intimate connection with them. Not that you have to be intimately connected with 400 people, but with some. And see, that's the key to all of this. Okay, I'm going to put it up here because I'm going to read it because I don't want to mess it up. Forming and living the Christian way of life is about building and fostering intentional community in all three spheres of our lives. This is what it means to be to live the Christian way of life. This is how the early church lived, that in all three of these spheres, this is what they sought to do. And they didn't build community as a means to an end. Sometimes we do things like, I'm going to be friends with this person so that I can share the gospel with them. I'm going to be friends with this person. No. People are not a means to an end. People are God's children, made in his image. And the early church didn't engage with the people around them because they wanted to necessarily, their motive wasn't like, we got to get more people in the seats at church. But their belief was the way that God is changing the world is through mutuality. How did God change the world? He came down to earth in the person of Jesus. John says in the beginning of John, he was flesh and blood. The fancy word for that is incarnation. He came and lived among us. And so we do for others what God has done for us in Jesus. And so in the same way Jesus came down to love and give himself for us, that's what we do for others. Not as a means to an end, but simply because this is how God works in the world. God works in the world through relationship. God works in the world through mutuality. So we go out into our pathways and we go out into our parish and we engage and we build and we foster intentional community. And the way that community becomes intentional is we engage in practices. And by intentionally engaging in practices, we foster and build community that partners with the transforming work of God. That's how you live the Christian way of life. Or the way that Jesus put it, that's how you live life to the fullest. There's been a lot of stuff in the media, most of y'all have probably seen it, about the revival that was happening at Asbury University and Asbury Seminary. Here's a picture that I just took from the internet. If you haven't heard the story, it's an incredible story. I can't quite figure out if it's over or not. I heard they were maybe ending it, but the whole thing started with like a normal chapel service. Asbury's a Christian university, and they had a normal chapel service like a lot of Christian universities do, and students are required to go to these chapels. And what's the funny part of the story is the guy who spoke at the chapel didn't even think he did a good job. I guess he texted his wife right afterwards. He was like, well, there was another stinker. But he got done, and people just stayed. And they prayed and they worshiped, and it turned into like this few-week-long thing, and people literally traveled from all over the world. And it became this revival, and like a lot of you, I probably read articles about it, and I heard people, like credible people, saying things like, this is a surprising work of God, and the Spirit is tangible, and God is transforming lives. But it was interesting the kind of back and forth because you had some people who were like, man, this is really revival. This is a great thing. And you had other people who were really skeptical of it, like, I don't know if it's revival. Again, going back to the point we read earlier, what Jesus said is you can tell a tree by its fruit. So over time, you'll know by the fruit that it develops. But everything that I saw and everything that I read, I think that was totally legit. I have no reason, I guess I could be super, super cynical, which I'm trying not to be, but I have no reason to believe this was anything but legit. Like it seemed like God was moving and God is doing something there and it was powerful and the people that went there had powerful things to say. And I saw a whole bunch of Christians like online and even through like various Christian media outlets that were like excited and wanting this to spread and this is the beginning and let it be the beginning and there's something new and there's something great and I hope this spreads all over the country. Because for a lot of Christians in this country, this is our hope. Like this is what we're after, revival. Revival. I'm going to say something super unpopular right now that's going to make you all really upset at me. I think this is a really cool thing. I do not think this is the path forward in this country. And it's not because I'm cynical of this. I'm not cynical of it at all. Again, I think it's a great thing. And Christian history is filled with moments of revival. And oftentimes these moments of revival preceded great things that happened. But if you look throughout Christian history, most of the success of the church in any culture has not come through revival, but through what historian Alan Creeder calls patient ferment. Fermentation is the process by which you make alcohol. And what happens in fermentation, some of you maybe you've done it. Maybe you've made your own beer or made your own whiskey or something like that. I've never done it. But you mix everything together and you leave it a lot of times in barrels. And the process of fermentation for a long time, there's really nothing. It just sits there. But then over time, you start to see these little bubbles pop up. And the little bubbles are a witness to something that has been happening all along, even though you couldn't see it. And over time, this whole thing has changed and it becomes something that it wasn't before. Not by some drastic process. Sometimes you see those like science shows where they mix two things. It's like, boom, there's a big cloud of smoke and everything's great. That's not how fermentation works. Fermentation is this slow process that happens at the very base, and only after so much time does you begin to actually see something. See, this is how the church throughout history has done its best work. Now again, I hope there's more moments of revival. I hope there's revival things that happen. Like the Christian history is filled with great moments of revival. But the reason we're drawn to revival is really because revival is big and fast and easy. Patient ferment, is really difficult. Because it takes time and it takes commitment and it takes you and I understanding that us living the Christian life right now in Huntington Beach, we may never see the results. But you know who might? Our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids. You know why the earliest church took over the Roman Empire in the 300s? Because people lived faithfully in the 100s and in the 200s. It was that process of patient ferment. This week, I was on 2 Zoom calls on Thursday, and it was like a super discouraging day. The first Zoom call in the morning, some of y'all know I've talked about it a little bit, not very much, but I'm in school right now. I'm in a seminary called Northern Seminary to get my doctorate. And there's this whole thing that blew up because there's like bullying accusations with the president. And it's in Chicago. I just go there twice a year. I have no history with it, so I don't know really any of these people. I just know the cohort that I'm a part of, but there was like this epic Zoom meeting, and people are angry and upset, and rightfully so. And it was just frustrating because you get off it and you hear about these things. You read about them of Christian leaders that fall or do things wrong. And I was like, oh my gosh. And it's just all this, drama, and people are angry. And it was just really a whole discouraging thing. And the behavior that he was accused of, just really frustrating. I turn around like an hour later and I get on another Zoom call with a group of pastors all over the country. And we spend that whole time talking about, there's one prominent pastor that made a comment like just talking to another group of pastors, and somebody shared it, but there was no context shared with it. And now everybody's mad and everybody's accusing them of this, that. And these other pastors, they're upset because and it was just more anger and division. And I got off that call and I was like, what's the freaking point? Like, it is such a disaster. Like, when you look at the shape of, like, we fall under the umbrella historically of what would be called evangelical Christianity. I have a lot of issues with the term evangelical, but at its core, if you look at the core definition, that's what we fall under. And it is like such a mess. And I'm looking at it going, these pastors I talk to, I mean, they're from like Minnesota and New Jersey, and they're from all over the place, and it's a wreck, and my school's in Chicago, and it's just like it's this disaster. And it just became overwhelming and discouraging because I'm like, what do we even do? Like, this whole thing has gone so badly. And in that moment, I don't often feel like God speaks to me, and God didn't say this audibly to me, so don't mishear me on that. But in that moment, here's what I felt God just kind of say to me. Focus on your corner of the kingdom. See, the problem with our social media-driven world is we always go to like these universal extremes. Got to save the world. Got to save the country. Got to save the state. The early church became the most powerful, largest movement on the planet, not because they set out to change the world, but because they chose to live faithfully in their local communities. If you would have told somebody who lived like in the hundreds, hey, if you can get to the 300s, the church is going to overtake the Roman Empire, they would have laughed at you. Wasn't in their wildest imagination. All they did was, let me live faithfully in my corner of the kingdom. Let me embody the Christian life. Let me commit myself to a parish, to a group of people where we will form together what it means to be as a Christian so we can go out and live it in the pathways in the parish. And that's how it became the largest, most influential movement in the world. Global, national, universal, regional change always happens because local churches commit to embodying the life of Jesus in their community. That's the way forward for us. I don't know what's going to happen in Northern Seminary. I don't know what's going to, I don't, that's beyond any of my control or ability. And to some extent, I've gotten to the point where I'm not even sure I care. But you know what I do care about? I care about this community experiencing the love and grace of Jesus Christ that has transformed my life. And so I will give my life to that. And that is what Christians throughout history have given their life to their communities, to their time, to their place, to one another, to committing to one another, to loving one another, to engaging one another, to not walking away from one another, to getting real and deep with one another, to opening up with one another, to struggling with one another. What does it mean to love our enemies? What does it mean to disagree? What does it mean to have vastly different opinions and go to the same church and share communion with one another? Because when we can do that here, and then we go out into the pathways and the porch and embody that, that's when transformation happens. That's when change happens. That's how we make a difference. I said earlier that one of the things that was central to our gathering was communion. So hopefully as you came in, you got handed communion. If you don't have communion and you want to celebrate this, you can raise your hand. We have people coming around that have this, so we have some down here. But just keep that hand up, and there will be people that will come around and they'll give you some communion. But communion is something that we celebrate because Jesus asked us to. And communion, a lot of times, I know in my own life, like I told you I've been a Christian my whole life, a lot of times communion just becomes one more thing that we do. And it's like, well, we got to do this real quick because we're obligated to do it because this is one of the things we have to do to keep God happy. That's not why we celebrate communion. We celebrate communion because it's a reminder of who we are and of whose we are. Communion is a meal that we share together. And so when we take communion together, we're signifying not just our commitment to Christ, but our commitment to one another. Communion is something that shouldn't just form us as individual Christians, it should form us as a community. We do this to remind ourselves that together we are the body of Christ, that he gave his body and his blood for us. And he's forming us not as individual people separate from one another, but as a body of people in this time and in this place and in this community. So if you want to peel back the top piece of plastic and grab that piece of bread. The bread is a reminder of Jesus' body, the body that he gave for us, the body through whose wounds we are being healed and brought together individually and collectively. So you go ahead and eat the bread. And if you peel back the next layer, Jesus said the cup represented his blood, which, if you think about it, is really gross. And for first century Jews, it was especially gross. But blood was the life force of any living thing. It's what gave life. And so whereas the body represents death, blood represents life. And we remember it's through Jesus that we have life. Again, individually, but also collectively. Whatever difference we're going to make in our corner of the kingdom is going to be because of the life of Jesus that is lived in and through us. Go ahead and drink the cup. Let me pray. God, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you that you came down to this earth and you lived in flesh and blood. That in Jesus we have a picture of God that we can wrap our arms and our minds around. And God, I know that in some ways it's discouraging to look around our world and our country. And it's discouraging to think about the future. But God, in all honesty, I probably have more hope now than I've had in a long time. Because I believe that behind all of this, you are reweaving something beautiful. A new creation, a new life, a new world, a new reality, and we are invited to participate in it. So God, help us as your people to commit to one another, to commit to this place, to commit to our corner of the kingdom. Because that's where change happens. That's where transformation happens. That's where it happens in us, and it's where it happens in the world. That we will experience transformation as we commit to one another. And the transformation that happens will then flow out of us in this place. God, we love you. We thank you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Unmatched in all your wisdom, in love and justice you will reign, and every knee will bow. Sing this with us. Sing, we bring our expectations. We bring our expectations. Our hope is anchored in your name, the name of Jesus. Oh, we trust the name of Jesus. You are the only King forever. Almighty God, we lift you higher. You are the only King forever, forevermore. You are victorious. You are the only King forever. Almighty God, we lift you higher. You are the only King forever, forevermore. You are victorious. We lift our banner high. We lift the name of Jesus. From age to age you reign. Your kingdom has no end. We lift our banner high. We lift the name of Jesus. From age to age you reign. Your kingdom has no end. You are the only King forever. Almighty God, we lift you higher. You are the only King forever, forevermore. You are victorious. You are the only King forever. Almighty God, we lift you higher. You are the only King forever, forevermore. You are victorious. We love you guys so much. We'll see you next week.